That sound is a recording I made of the wind at Jung and Maka during a summer storm, moving through the trees like a gushing river, the breath of the land. A nondescript hill just outside Armagh city, jealously concealing the secrets of its otherworldly past. The ancient, legendary home of the Red Branch, of the goddess Macha, font of the Ulster cycle stories and of Ireland's greatest heroes. Armagh soaks in mythological history, a dreamer's capital, a lost kingdom of ancient glory now just a whisper through leaves and grass. I sat up there a few years ago with a notebook and pen, seeking inspiration. My younger daughter had just started nursery and was in for an hour each day, which rendered it pointless going back home and back again. I was writing a novel at the time and was stuck on a particular part and thought, I'm going to walk to the top of Jung and Maka, Navan Fort as it's also known, and see if the forces that reside up there could help fix my writer's block. I'd heard the story of how the site got its name, how the goddess Macha lost her twins, how she cursed the Ulstermen. At that time it was just a story, just a fairy tale to me, ignoring that niggling thought in the back of my mind that it rang true on some level. As an Ulsterman, you can sometimes feel cursed. The whole of the North can. But this was folklore, oral tradition. There's no study of the story, no dissection or analysis, almost a hearsay. The myth was blurry, somehow underwater, distorted and difficult to follow. I knew nothing of the character of Macha herself, of her tripartite nature, of the Morrigan, the war goddess. I just wanted someone or something to write my book for me. It was a 3-day week for my little girl in school that September, so I went 3 times. I'd always fancied I'd felt a presence up there on the mound. Once you step through that circle, the one drawn by Macha herself through the earth with the pin of her brooch, that portal to the other world. There's a definite change in the ether, shifting and morphing, sometimes playful, sometimes serious, always watching. It was comfortable to remain in the realm of there's just something about that place and energy without ever having to dig any deeper. And so, in New Age ignorance, I sat and attempted to draw the energy of the land into myself, translate it onto a page for my own ends. But the mind had other ideas. It turns out the sacred feminine isn't something a man with zero knowledge of what he's messing with can simply leverage for his own selfish purposes. That's the kind of thing that leads to curses. At first, whatever presence dances around that site, it gave intuitions, landscapes, images of foxes, soft beings, sprites and fairies whispering teasingly that maybe I'd lived here before, many times in eons beyond, and I left with a blank page. On the second visit, the old bent fairy trees seemed to want to speak. There was snow, autumn, Samhain, and more blank pages. On the third day, nonchalant and carefree, I settled into a relaxed meditation to see how far my mind could drift, who or what I could run alongside. At this stage, the whole mythological landscape was purely academic, conceptual, an idea, a playful story, and nothing I ever thought of as real. This, to me, was still Navan Fort, the fun time mound, good for walks and of vague spiritual importance. I didn't know at this stage that the deity said to inhabit the site is threefold in nature: Macha, the maiden, goddess of fertility, abundance, sovereignty, the land, and horses. Bibe, the old lady, referred to as the crone or hag traditionally, now the sage or oracle, representing wisdom, foreboding, and a harbinger of death. And the main, goddess of war, the terrible face of the sacred feminine. These make up the Morrigan, one of the most terrifying figures in Irish mythology and not to be trifled with. And that sunny September morning, I think it was Nemain my wandering consciousness bumped into. My mind leapt as if electrocuted. A strange terror sparked through my whole body, a feeling I'd never felt there before. Images of armed warriors and a woman's face in yellow and red flashed before me, topped off with a deep, deep dread. I jumped up in a panic, heart thundering, and ran all the way to my car, flocks of crows cawing and flapping through the sky. A first taste of the reality, perhaps, the myth made corporeal. A maiden voyage into the supernatural, a world utterly alien to me. Logic, science, reason head pretty quickly for the door when you're bitten by the land. And if you don't think mythology can jump out from behind the veil every now and again and can come alive, well, you've never been chased down a hill by a goddess, have you? The feeling lingered for weeks, that dread feeling of being haunted, possessed, watched. I couldn't hear a crow cry without a cold fear creeping through me. I threw myself into reading mythology, desperate for reassurance. Who or what was that? I kept returning to the site, sometimes alone, sometimes with my children, and it was strange to watch them play and laugh and run around like everyone else while I stood nervously, feeling that tug on the strings of my mind and refusing to be drawn back in, refusing to look at her again. The site used to be Navan Fort for me, playground for dog walkers and New Age solstice chasers. After that encounter, it became Jung and Maka, sacred site of the earth goddess, womb of the north, and very, very real. I eventually made my peace with the site, calming down over time. The more I learned about the nature of the sacred feminine, the more I realised that she is not gentle when teaching you a lesson. Don't enter the sacred space of the goddess without the proper respect, because you will get a hard jolt back. If you approach a horse from behind, expect a kick in the head. But the dark goddess is not malevolent. She is healing and redemptive. She'll give you the wisdom you need. She just prefers her lessons the hard way. The story of the curse of Macha, or Macha's twins, also known as the debility of the Ulstermen, is the foundation myth of Ulster, and I believe the earliest intimations of the character of the Ulstermen. It's where Jung and Maka gets its name, the same site Cuchulainn makes his way to as the boy Setanta and performs his famous boyhood deeds, when the mysterious Cathbad the Druid makes the prophecy that changes the young hero's fate. It is the backbone of the town because it's how the Ulstermen earned their debility and the reason that the task of defending Ulster falls on Cuchulainn alone. The tale itself seems to sit outside the main contents of the Ulster Cycle collection. The tone and texture is completely different to the town. A strange tale that doesn't fit the style of the other myths. One that seems distinct, dark, and weird. First, I'll tell the story itself, as it's a lesser known tale than most. Although versions of the tale are written, its transmission through the oral tradition means there are many different versions, especially for locals of Armagh. So everyone may have heard a slightly different variation, but the premise of the story goes like this. Kruniac, a poor unfortunate farmer of Ulster, had a tough life. After his beloved wife died, he was left to raise his young children alone, working the fields by day and tending to his neglected home and children in the evenings. One evening, when he arrived home, a young and beautiful woman was in his kitchen cooking by the fire. The house was tidier than it had been in years, and the children were tended to and sitting happily. She told him her name was Macha, and she would now be his wife. Although astonished, Kruniac did not argue. He agreed and settled into married life with Macha, his life becoming infinitely better as Macha cooked, cleaned, raised the children, and stayed a loving wife. Kruniac suspected Macha was a woman from the other world. Now and then he would observe her movements. When she ran, she was swift as the wind, her feet barely touching the ground. Before long, Macha was pregnant with Kruniac's child. One day, the King of Ulster, Crothair MacNessa, announced a feast to celebrate the acquisition of new horses. His stable was a source of immense pride to him, and his horses were famed to be the fastest in the land. Excited to attend, Kruniac prepared to leave, saying goodbye to a heavily pregnant Macha and the children. Taking him aside, Macha warned him not to speak of her to the men of Ulster, for if he did, disaster would be brought upon them. Kruniac promised and left to attend the feast. And what a feast it was! Kruniac, with all the men and heroes of Ulster, ate and drank until their hearts were content, and as the feast went on, tongues began to loosen. Soon enough, some of the men began to boast about their wives, and when one told of the outstanding beauty of his wife, Kruniac bit his tongue. When another boasted of the cooking skills of his wife, again, Kruniac stayed silent. Finally, when the king began to boast of his new chariot horses and their incredible speed, Kruniac could stay silent no longer and told how his wife could easily outrun these horses in a race, giving her incredible speed. When the comment reached Crother's ears, he was incensed. His prowess was defined by his horses being the best and most swift in the land, and he couldn't bear the insult. He demanded that Macha be sent for in order for a race to take place. Kruniac begged for mercy, pleading that his wife was pregnant, but the king threatened that if she did not come, his life would be forfeit. When the king's men arrived at Macha's house and told her what Kruniac had said and reiterated that Kruniac's life was in danger if she did not turn up, she agreed to accompany them. Upon arrival, the king thundered that Kruniac had insulted him by saying she could outrun his magnificent horses, and that now she would have to race them to give him his satisfaction. Macha, pointing to her heavily pregnant belly, begged the king to have mercy, giving her vulnerability. But Crother's pride was so great, her pleas fell on deaf ears. Macha turned to the warriors of Ulster, the brave Creve Rua, and pleaded they intercede on her behalf, but none would step forward, either for fear of the king's wrath or a drunken desire to see the race and its outcome. As the men of Ulster gathered round to watch the spectacle take place on the even race ground outside the king's fort, Macha took her place on the starting line, barefoot, beside the heavy chariot of the king. The yell went up and off they ran, the king's horses running like the wind and the chariot almost flying behind them. But, no matter how fast they ran, Macha kept pace, her feet barely touching the ground, to the astonishment of the Ulstermen. A terrible scream ran out from Macha as she overtook the king's horses, and the faces of the Ulstermen dropped, now unsure, no longer taking the pleasure they thought they would in this cruel event. Macha crossed the finish line victorious, but screaming, she went into labour on the grass and gave birth to twins, a little boy and a little girl, neither of which were alive. Enraged, drenched in blood, furious, she stood, gathered her lifeless children in her arms, and revealed herself to be a goddess to the terror of the assembled men. Pointing an accusing finger, she told the men of Ulster, for the humiliation they have forced upon her, for their refusal to use their strength to help her when she needed it most, their failure to intercede on her and her children's behalf, to feel pity for a woman in such a vulnerable state. She would bless the Ulstermen with great strength, but would also curse them, that at the moment of their greatest need, they will find themselves afflicted with the weakness of a woman in childbirth. With her lifeless children in her arms, she leapt over the heads of the Ulstermen and vanished, never to be seen again. From that day forth, the site was known as Alwyn Maka, Macha's twins. Intense, nightmarish, horrific, and deeply symbolic. But what are we to make of this story? What is the moral or the warning here? Why would an Ulsterman or someone under the direction of the king come up with an origin story for the kingdom of Alwyn Maka like this? The king comes across as a tyrant, the Ulstermen as moral cowards, and the founding narrative of the men of the north is weakness. This isn't propaganda or self-aggrandizement, it's something deeper. This feels like truth, not literal truth, but eternal truth. Now, there may be some listeners grinding their teeth thinking this isn't the version they've heard. In other versions, Macha also dies, or all three survive but disappear to the other world. Myths seem to travel through time. They evolve and morph and live through everyone. But they're not there to be quibbled over at the level of detail, but to provide that eternal insight. In a way, it doesn't much matter which version you know, as long as the bones remain the same. Carson's cathedral from the previous episode. One clue of this, the uncle of Cuchulainn from the Ulster cycle and king of Ulster, Crothair MacNessa, is the king in this story as well as the king of the Ulstermen in the Táin. It doesn't make much sense that the king in the Táin, the cattle-rated Cooley, is the same ruler who incurred the wrath of Macha, and just a few years later is hosting Cuchulainn with the rest of the Red Branch. Even the Táin gives the impression that the curse of the Ulstermen was a more distant event. Owen Macha feels very well established during the Táin, not something that was just created within the lifetime of the king. And we never hear that name Kruniac again throughout the whole of the Ulster cycle. The earliest written versions of the myth appear in the Book of Leinster and other sources, which are woven together. However, in one version there is no name of the king, or any other characters but Macha and Kruniac. The most narrative details seem to come from the folklore tradition. Here we see the myth's mask slip, that unfathomable form underneath, showing until it puts on its Celtic clothes once again, masking the eternal king as Crothair MacNessa and the eternal feminine as Macha. There is no mention of what the kingdom was called prior to the name Owen Macha. The tale is an eternal pattern of being, likely a much older story, conveying a truth or a warning for those who want to listen and understand. So what truths are this story trying to convey? It's tempting to view mythology as unimportant, as fanciful stories brewed long ago with no real relevance to today's society. Archaic tales from ancient people attempting to explain the world through the lens of their limited understanding. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to dismiss anything from the ancient past. We can't afford that kind of arrogance. It's not like the modern world is without its issues. But what could a collection of old stories possibly have to offer us? Especially one as strange as that of Macha's twins. Carl Jung believed that myths weren't just random stories, but reflections of deep patterns or archetypes embedded in the human psyche, which are part of a collective unconscious. The internal universe populated with images denoting powerful psychic energies, psychological truths dramatised in story. Joseph Campbell had his own ideas about Jung's concepts, describing myths as collective dreams and dreams as personal myths, meaning it was possible not just for the individual to dream, but for humanity to collectively dream, for a nation or a people to have its collective dreams as stories. And if we can interpret dreams in relation to the dreamer, we can do the same thing with myths in relation to a people, culture, or country. Dreams illuminate the elusive archetypes, those deep patterns of primal behaviours, autonomous deities with their own motivations that shape our everyday lives, our stories and our behaviour. Like dreams, myths speak in poetry and are full of symbols that Jung realised were universal throughout the world. Dreams seem to communicate with us as if from an outside source, and can often reveal information the dreamer was previously unaware of, if they know what they're looking for, if they know how to speak the language of the unconscious and its symbols. But why does it have to be so abstract? Why can't the dream simply be a voice saying, here's exactly what you need to do? Dreams communicate in the language of the unconscious, a type of symbolic poetry and divine metaphor, and it's up to us to pay attention and understand what it's saying through the lens of our own personality and makeup. In ancient Greece, there was a lesser-known deity called Nyx, the goddess of the night. When the atmosphere changes at nightfall, when that stillness pervades, when the darkness begins to gently sweep across the land and sky, that was Nyx, a goddess so ancient she was said to have predated creation itself, to have always been. God the Mother, so powerful that even Zeus was terrified of her. Nyx is the personification of the unconscious, the divine feminine. Consciousness as an ordering principle, as the light by which we see, is a manifestation of the divine masculine, the light bearer, the tiny boat in the enormity of the ocean. If consciousness is this little planet, the unconscious is the vastness of outer space. Which makes sense. We are conscious during the day when the light shines, and at night, the time of the unconscious, symbolised by the moon, a very feminine symbol, we lie down and slip into an unconscious state where we exist in the other realm, one where messages are communicated by metaphor. Only conscious man, empirical man, can communicate in words. In Christian theology, Christ, who Jung described as an archetype of the self, as consciousness itself, is described as the Word. God the Father in the Christian religion, like others, did not create the world with his hands, but rather spoke it into existence through a void that was pre-existent, already there, just as your conscious self sits on top of a much older unconscious reality. Words are ordering, divine masculine, while the divine feminine is instinctual. The story of Macha's twins and the curse of the Ulstermen is odd, to say the least, even by mythological standards. It's dark, nightmarish, bizarre, and tragic, but there's something about it that's outlasted generations. The story's not like a modern novel with a cliffhanger. It's not a hero story where the Ulstermen come out looking noble or brave. So why exactly is this weird nightmare prevailed when so many other stories fade? To look deeper, we need to go back to Jung. Jung saw the task of life as a process he referred to as individuation, or the realization of the whole self. In Jungian terms, the self is the totality of a person. To bring the whole psyche, the soul, into the light of consciousness, including everything dark and uncomfortable about you. The process of individuation begins with the integration of what Jung termed the shadow. The shadow is everything about yourself you disregard, repress, or ignore. It's the dark version of you, the one locked away. The things about you that you hate or deemed unsuitable or inappropriate for the culture you live in have been banished to the shadow. Selfishness, greed, violent tendencies, the depraved side you hate. Not everything in the shadow is negative, though. Alongside the monster within is your wounded inner child. Your golden creativity lies buried, shoved deep down because you learned as a child or a teenager that no one around you would appreciate it or tolerate it, that you'd be ridiculed or attacked for your desire to sing or dance or love. Everyone to some extent has betrayed their true self to fit in, mostly in childhood or as a teenager. And the life journey is to get back to that original self. Christ, as the archetype of the self, gives A. Russell's famous line a profound impact. Quote, "In the boyhood of Judas, Christ was betrayed." Unquote. The shadow contains within it everything that frightens you, all of your fears, that thing you run from in dreams, the ones where your legs don't work. The people you despise in life or are scared of only show traits you hate and deny in yourself. But because they are unconscious, because you're wholly unaware of them, you project them outwards onto other people. You might meet a rich, obnoxious, boastful person and instantly hate him. But what you're really lashing out at is the repressed, assertive side of you. That demanding, selfish part you need to get ahead in life. That proactive ability to get what you want. Somewhere along the line you learn to banish that part of you for whatever reason, and now you can't stand to see it in others. And the rich guy you're looking at might not even have those qualities. You've just thrown all of your baggage at him and leapt to a conclusion, when in reality, he's a mirror. The whole world is a mirror reflecting back the contents of your own soul. And here's the catch. You can never destroy what you dislike about yourself. You can push it down for as long as you can, but it will never disappear. Instead, the longer it stays in the dark, the more it desperately wants to be brought into the light, the more it broods and turns resentful. And eventually, when it's had enough of the dark, it begins to act of its own accord, independently, coming out in behaviours you have no control over. Those times you behave in ways against your better judgment, a lifetime of repressing your wilder side, your violent side or assertive side can lead to repressed rage at all those times you didn't fight back, all those things you should have said, those fantasies where you give the cutting comebacks to people who wronged you that were never uttered at the time, those relationships you sabotage, those arguments you start with the people you love, the ones you instantly regret, wondering what made you act that way. As Jung said, quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Unquote. It's strange that we have the capacity to behave in ways we don't want to, and yet can't stop. How often do you absolutely need to study for an exam or sit down and get something important done? Every fibre of your being knows this task is essential to your future, and yet you procrastinate, you do nothing, and you suffer for it. And when the opportunity passes you by, you say, it just wasn't meant to be. It was fate. All because we're not transparent to ourselves. As St. Paul said, quote, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. Unquote. We're not who we like to think we are. We like to believe we are the image the ego was set up to keep us safe and sane, but that's not you. There's a hidden you, a more whole you. Integrating the shadow or shadow work has become a psychological term with various techniques developed by Jung and those that came after him. Integrating the shadow leads to the gold, to wholeness, to the treasure hard to obtain. It doesn't mean becoming the negative qualities that make up the shadow, but rather recognizing that they are part of you, acknowledging them, accepting them, bringing them into the light and putting them to positive use. But also in there are your talents, your creative side and your inner child. This process is nothing new. It's been acted out in mythological form across cultures for thousands of years. The shadow has most famously been portrayed as humanity's sum of all fears, the dragon. The age-old myth of the dragon guarding the gold, or a princess, is familiar to everyone. The knight, the ego, must confront the dragon, the shadow, and retrieve the gold or save the princess. After that, the knight's life changes. He's ready to become king, a mythological symbol for the self. I will be looking a lot more at the archetype of the king, especially in relation to Crone later in this series. But who or what is the princess? Deep within the male psyche is what Jung called the anima, the female soul image in man. If the persona is the bridge between the ego and the conscious world, the anima is the bridge between the ego and the soul. The word anima literally means breath. The word animate means to breathe life into something. Like cartoons, the drawings are still and dead until they become animated. She is the archetype of life. Men that are full of life are animated. A man's anima determines how he sees women. Working in the same way as the shadow, projecting the image you have of the feminine onto women, and without proper relationship to the feminine, you never see women as they really are, but as the image your anima has created, mostly based on your mother. So through this lens, what meaning can we take from the myth of Macha's twins? Like a dream telling us something we didn't already know, what is Ulster's foundation myth trying to communicate? The myth is dense and succinct, and almost every detail has significance. Kruniac is a farmer who has lost the feminine influence in life. In Jungian analysis, myths mirror the psyche. The landscape in the story is the dramatization of the mind, and I see Kruniac as the representation of the ego consciousness, that element of the mind that gives you the feeling of I, of who you are, that encounters the archetypes and takes energy from them, that goes through life with no idea who it really is. In the story, he's a normal man, an everyman, a working man. He has masculine strength and authority over his children, but without the feminine influence, he struggles to keep his house in order, and his children clothed and nurtured. Macha, when she appears, is a personification of the sacred feminine, the eros, the feminine in its light manifestation, an anima of this psychic landscape. Kruniac's relationship to her is the relationship between ego and anima. And when she enters into Kruniac's life in a positive way, it gets exponentially better. Crucially, Kruniac agrees to Macha's proposal that she becomes his wife, therefore inviting the spirit of the feminine in, acknowledging her, integrating Macha into his everyday life, and entering into a relationship with her. And now that his anima is in check, his life is softer, his children cared for, everything is better. Outside of the psyche, as I talked about in the previous episode, is the sacred or divine feminine, the feminine as such, the cosmic element of collective femininity, represented through the ages in myth. She is Mother Nature, the Great Mother, the Earth Goddess, Sophia. The energy sat alongside God the Father at the beginning of creation. God the Father spoke the universe into being. God the Mother embodied it, birthed it, and became everything we see in the physical world. A. Russell characterised the Great Father in Irish myths as Lear and the Great Mother as Danu. Together they create the universe, one as embodiment, the other as organising principle. Shiva and Shakti. God the Mother is the spirit that animates the world, that gives life a heartbeat, a pulse, breath, that elusive element that gives reality a forward motion. The reason we don't just all sit still and fall apart. She's the animator. The Buddhists and Hindus refer to part of the divine feminine as Maya, the great illusionist, the constantly changing, restless force that creates the illusion of dualistic reality. The sacred feminine in its light form is abundant, nurturing, compassionate, creative, and beautiful. But she can also be destructive, terrible, dark, and frightening. In the same way that nature gives us the sustenance we need to live, the materials to build homes, water, and life, but can wipe it all out with a hurricane, earthquake, famine, or war. I don't agree that war is man-made. Rather, it's nature inverted. There's a substance to it, a metaphysics represented by the dark goddesses. In the Western world these days, men have a static view of the feminine, firmly stuck in the maiden, the Aphrodite or Venus aspect of the feminine, the goddesses of beauty, passion, youth, and sex. As a society, we have a maiden-centric view of women, firmly ensconced in the fabric of the reality we've created for ourselves. Attractive, young, submissive. Other forms of the feminine, old women, aggressive women, warrior women, are not so acceptable. Today we dismiss the wisdom of the sage. We ridicule the women that should be today's elders. We call her Karen and belittle her. Today the Oracle of Delphi would be in a YouTube video being mocked as hysterical or unreasonable, instead of looking into the mirror she's holding up to the one holding the camera. She's been turned from seer back into witch. We sell anti-aging cream, banishing wrinkles, combating the effects of aging as if it's a curse, something unnatural. Reverse the signs of aging, banish the hag, the modern equivalent to burning witches. This is a huge failure of Cuchulainn throughout the Ulster cycle, where he and Bibe, the crone of the Morrigan Trinity, constantly clash. Cuchulainn has a tempestuous relationship with the feminine, to say the least, and the king is a disaster. The next thing we hear of in the Macha twins story is the nature of the king. The male psyche is made up of 4 masculine archetypes: the warrior, the magician, the lover, and the king. The king archetype in the male psyche is where a man gets his morality. It's what he places above all else. The king sits in the highest throne of the male mind, and if he is benevolent, kind, and abundant, society will run well, and the world will be good. For Ireland, in the Christian age, Christ was king, in that the idea was to make the ways of Christ sit in the highest echelon of the psyche and have it influence the society. In the story, we get intimations that the king is a prideful tyrant who loves horses. That's a significant detail. Horses in Irish mythology are symbols of wildness, nature, and the feminine. The king owns them. He races them. To him, they are possessions and items of status. It's also strange that Macha, as the goddess of sovereignty and the land, is also the goddess of horses. There are echoes of this later in the Ulster cycle when Cuchulainn has twin horses, one of which is named Macha's Grey. This attitude of the king towards the feminine symbolises the dominant view of the society to the feminine, just like a misogynistic attitude in a man's mind would inform his whole worldview if it flows from his king archetype. In Irish mythology, the king cannot take the proper kingship without permission from the land goddess. This is why they are sovereignty goddesses. The king has to accept the feminine in all its forms to be chosen, not through lineage or prestige, but through relationship and acceptance of every incarnation of the feminine, even the dark side. In the tale of Niall of the Nine Hostages, Niall and his brothers approach a well, which is guarded by a hideous hag. The brothers all flee in disgust, but Niall kisses her properly. In some versions he sleeps with her, and she transforms into a beautiful radiant goddess and grants him the high kingship. Niall has the qualities already to realise his kingship, and as Jung says, the anima is a bridge to the soul, to the self, to true kingship, to self-realisation. We see this motif in mythology all over the world, the archetype of the hag offering uncomfortable wisdom. This is depicted most famously in Beauty and the Beast. The arrogant prince dismisses the old lady at his door with the rose, preferring to stay in the company of young, beautiful women, and is cursed for his attitude towards her. So what is the spectrum of the sacred feminine? Jung's investigations into the anima led him to realise that what was catastrophically missing from the Christian model was any representation of the female. The Trinity is presented as an all-male cast and is therefore incomplete. In a more complete version, we would have the Father, Mother, Son, and Holy Spirit. However, the Holy Spirit for me seems to already meet the criteria for being the sacred feminine, disguised as a more male element of the Trinity. And this disguise makes it something very difficult to identify or define. No one quite knows who or what the Holy Spirit is supposed to be. Typically, the Holy Spirit is referred to as the animating spirit of reality. And like I said earlier, the word animate means to breathe life into. So we have the Father as the source of the laws that govern the universe, the Mother as the embodiment of the physical universe, provider and sustainer of life, the Son as the organising principle, consciousness or logos. So where's the fourth element? Psychologically, this would be the shadow, the pride. Religiously or mythologically, the divine shadow pride, the dark side of God, is represented by the archetype of Lucifer. All our lives in the West, we have learned of God as a male entity who can be all-loving, but also dark and fearful, never knowing that we were missing 50% of the image of God. God the Mother, the feminine, of which the dark side is just as frightening as that of the Father. But pre-Christian culture in Ireland represented the feminine in all of its forms, as did the Greeks and Romans. And there are cultures today that still do, like Hinduism. But why do men so fear the dark and powerful feminine? Well, let's take the crone, hag, or sage. She is represented as the washerwoman at the ford. This is Bibe in Irish mythology. And if you saw this spectral old woman washing blood from clothes or armour, it meant your impending death. This later became the folklore of the Banshee, a figure that haunted the minds of children when I was a child constantly. We'd stand in laneways and fields talking about how she lived in there somewhere, haunting the dark places we dreaded to walk. Lying in bed at night, I dreaded hearing her piercing scream. She is the transition to death itself. And if death has any personification in the past, it was feminine. The anima as the archetype of life must also be the harbinger of death, because without death and decay, there is no renewal and new life. The goddess of birth must have a corresponding goddess of death. And just as there is a goddess of harmony in nature and beauty and abundance, so too is there a goddess of the opposite, when things fall apart and nature is inverted, a goddess of killing, of maiming. Just as there is a reality to birth and beauty in life, so too is there a reality of the wound, the slash, the guts being ripped out and eaten, rotten bodies, decay, putrefaction, maggot-riddled corpses sinking into mud. This is Nemain, the goddess of war. And she strikes a terrifying figure in earlier Irish mythology. She represents battle frenzy, the chaos of war, the terror of fighting to the death. She is the fabric of war itself, the brutal reality, the frenzied hacking, the tooth and nail. In earlier Irish myths, Macha, Bibe and Nemain are the three sisters of the Morrigan, the war goddess. Quote, "It was then that Bibe and Macha and Nemain went to the knoll of the taking of the hostages, and to the hill of summoning of hosts of Tara, and sent forth magic showers of sorcery, and compact clouds of mist, and a furious rain of fire, with a downpour of red blood from the air on the warriors' heads, and they allowed the fair bulg neither rest nor stay for 3 days and nights." Unquote. In the Táin, the Main appears also when Cuchulainn falls into a terrible rage at the sight of the Connacht army. Quote, "He took the shield and brandished the spears and waved the sword and flung forth his warriors' roar from deep in his throat, so that the goblins and ghouls and sprites of the glen and the fiends of the air gave answer, so fearsome was his utterance. Then the Nemain threw the army into confusion. The spear points and weapons of the allied army clashed tumultuously, and 100 warriors fell dead as their hearts burst with terror in the middle of the camp and on the ramparts that night." Unquote. In India, the goddess Kali is still worshipped, and a major figure in Hinduism today. For me, the Hindu religion gets it right when it comes to the darker feminine side, and Kali is by no means the only personification of this energy, the embodiment of the grim realities of blood, death, chaos and destruction. Interestingly, Kali also represents time, the eventual killer of all. In India, women have a figure they can identify with when they feel rage or frustration, when the darkness arises. For Western women, these feelings are traditionally dismissed and internalized. For obvious reasons, men fear these goddesses, but they misunderstand. The fear is caused by what man cannot tame. The untamed aspects of nature, death, chaos, and birth, are things man can never control, and therefore these goddesses will always be something frightening to them. They will always be subservient to these forces, to these goddesses, which is why a real man, a true king, must submit to the feminine, and this can be the hardest thing to do. Instead of defeating the dark goddesses, men can choose to pretend they don't exist. And this is how Western civilization has progressed through the Christian model, with the logos as the only element of reality, and eros as something to be scoffed at. This logos-only idea of the world has catastrophic consequences, enthroning the purely rational, the scientific, morality and order as all that exists. Systems like capitalism run amok when they are based solely on growth, resource and wealth with no eros to temper it, leading to the idea that there is no limit to growth, to the idea that natural resources are a commodity with no limit. This leads to catastrophic damage to nature without replenishment. But worst of all, this leads us to believe that this way of life is natural, normal and inevitable, meaning the feminine, the eros, is in the dark, non-existent. A whole 50% of reality lies hidden. And this circumstance means women are essentially gaslit their entire lives in a society where being predominantly of the divine feminine, as women are, is looked at as irrational, hysterical and less intelligent. In the logos-only society, anything that cannot be proven is not real. Whereas women tend to be intuitive, they hold knowledge in their bodies, their skin, they sense things before they happen, before men have any inkling something is going on. Things like astrology, psychic powers, divination, connection with nature are all written off as unscientific, when actually what most men mean is uncomfortably unmanly, unfathomable to the male mind, and therefore not real, not possible, and the product of silly fantasy. This can lead women to believe something is wrong with them, especially younger women. They try to compete in a society ruled by the masculine alone, and are praised only when they achieve within the boundaries set by this system, to the detriment of their true calling. Even relationships, dating, marriage are, without most realising it, logos-led. What a society where the feminine is fully visible would look like, I have no idea. We don't even know what that would be. But I think at this stage the feminine is in ascendancy, and we can all feel that disturbance in the force. God the Mother making her appearance. I've gone a little off topic here because this subject is just so vast and I love it. I'll be returning to this in more detail in the episodes regarding Maeve in the Ulster cycle. Suffice to say, the Ulster cycle shows us a society where both masculine and feminine divinity are present, where interactions and relationships exist in a completely different framework, which is maybe why the world of ancient Irish myth seems so alien. Back to the story. When the feast is announced, Macha tells Kruniac that while he's away with the other men, he can't talk about her. Kruniac is aware there is something different about his wife, something otherworldly, but this is a strange detail to include. Why can't Kruniac talk about her? It's mysterious, yet the whole myth hinges on this detail. Macha being the personification of the feminine means that Kruniac is integrated and lives in relationship with her. The feminine is not a commodity for men to benefit from, or to boast of, or to try and get to write a novel for you. Using the divine feminine, just as looking at women as objects rather than people, to boost your status or ego can only lead to disaster. Jung warned of the danger of ego inflation. When someone gains spiritual insight but allows the ego to appropriate that insight for its own ends, this can lead to madness, hubris, or collapse, which is exactly what happens to Kruniac and, by extension, Ulster. You see this a lot online today. Enlightened people, healed people, making that journey about self-aggrandizement rather than quietly living with their newfound happiness. Identifying yourself as the archetype of the healer rather than being healed by the archetype is a common trap. By telling Kruniac to keep silent, Macha is protecting the balance between ego and soul. She knows that her presence is powerful, and the power must be held with reverence, not broadcast for applause. When Kruniac gets to the feast, the men inevitably start to boast about their wives' beauty and cooking abilities, during which Kruniac stays silent. It's only when the king speaks about his horses that Kruniac pipes up. I think Macha and horses at this point are the same thing, both symbols of the sacred feminine, nature, wildness, the creative instinct. The difference is that Kruniac is in relationship with the sacred feminine, whereas the king exploits it, believes he owns it, meaning the society is predicated on ownership of the feminine, not relationship. Similar to today, logos only, and so he uses it to impress upon other men his authority and stature. Kruniac betrays his relationship with the feminine. His mistake is to identify with an archetype instead of draw energy from it. Over-identification with the warrior or magician or lover or king can leave you out of your depth very quickly. Humility is the key. What we see next is the Ulsterman's poor behaviour. This part feels very believable. Here the Ulstermen feel abysmally. Kruniac fears for his own life and immediately caves to the will of the king, while his warriors do not hesitate to fetch a heavily pregnant and therefore very vulnerable Macha from her home and bring her to the feast. The idea of drunken men cheering at a pregnant woman and the humiliating spectacle of Macha begging the king to have mercy, giving her delicate state, is difficult to read or listen to, a feeling I suspect women in contemporary Ulster are not unfamiliar with. The king is uncompromising, rigid. Rigid things shatter, they're fragile. The king's fragile pride has been wounded and, like his horses, he thinks he has ultimate power over the feminine as a commodity to satisfy a slight from a lowly farmer. When the culture is too masculine, it loses its sense of chivalry and the instinct to protect and revere the feminine. And with limited understanding of the female element of their soul, disaster can quickly follow. When Macha takes the starting position, there's a real sense of dread in the story. The Ulstermen, the warriors of the Creve Rua, do not come to the aid of a pregnant woman. This seals Macha's fate, and theirs. None of the men stood up for her. None of them used their strength when she needed it most. Men, no matter how powerful, who fail to integrate the anima, fail to honour the sacred feminine, are ultimately weak. By the way, this isn't just a curse of the men of Ulster, it's a curse on the women of Ulster too, because weak men are a curse to women. And just look at the contemporary femicide statistics for modern Ulster to see that. And because of the unconscious behaviours that emerge from negative anima projection, seeing life as ultimately negative, tend to emerge when you need your strength the most. You lack enthusiasm for life, you are not animated. You're at the mercy of irrational moods and behaviour. Remember, the anima is the archetype of life itself. You are at war with life, fighting, resisting, and like quicksand, the more you struggle against it, the more entrenched you become in your own misery. The darker and the more terrifying your female soul image becomes, until that depression ends with the anima as a death demon, your suicide. You are essentially cursed, like the Ulstermen. If you're unconscious of this, you project it out. In the 16th century, men saw this deteriorating image of women in their psyches projected outward and started burning women as witches in a desperate attempt to wipe the anima out. In modern cultures, we see movies like The Ring, where the dark and petrifying anima figure crawls out of a well, slick with the horrors of nature's darkness, damp, decay, putrefaction. In this story, the wounded anima disappears, or is repressed, but still affects the behaviour of the Ulsterman. The feminine wound becomes the pain of the Ulsterman. Their curse is to feel the pain of childbirth at the moment of their greatest need. When they need their strength the most, their strength will fail them, just as it failed Macha at her hour of greatest need. Just like your feminine wound, unconscious, may lead you to constantly fail at the last hurdle. The job interview you messed up on the day, the opportunity to ask the girl out you didn't take, the relationship you didn't save. Remember what Jung said? You will call it fate. Of the anima, Jung says, and this statement is essentially the debility of the Ulstermen in a scientific passage rather than mythological form. Quote, she is the much needed compensation for the risks, struggles, sacrifices that all end in disappointment. She is the solace for all the bitterness of life. And, at the same time, she is the great illusionist, the seductress who draws him into life with her Maya, and not only into life's reasonable and useful aspects, but into its frightful paradoxes and ambivalences where good and evil, success and ruin, hope and despair counterbalance one another. Because she is his greatest danger, she demands from man his greatest, and if he has it in him, she will receive it. Unquote. What I've talked about so far is the very archetypal part of the story, the bones of which are found in many other mythological cycles. But what makes Armagh's myth different and more nightmarish than others is the strange inclusion of the twins. On the finish line, Ulster's mistreatment of the sacred feminine results in the death of baby twins, a girl and a boy. What are we to make of that? Twins are a common mythological motif across cultures and across time. They can often represent the duality of nature, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. They are symbiotic, dependent on each other, the way opposites are. There are two types of twins that I know of in mythology. There's the archetype of the hostile brothers, where one overcomes the other, such as Romulus and Remus, or Cain and Abel. And the male-female twins, such as Apollo and Artemis in Greek mythology, Freyr and Freya in Norse mythology, Osiris and Isis in ancient Egypt, usually symbolising the dichotomy between order and wildness, law and war, structure and beauty, as well as the sun and moon, the ultimate expression of the divine masculine and feminine. Which is what the site of Awan Maka seems to represent. Recent archaeological findings found that the large mound, a temple to the sun god Lu, the sun as such, and the smaller mound, the goddess mound, the moon, are connected in a figure of 8. And if you look at the path of the sun and moon through the sky, you can see that they are figures of 8. There is an eternal dance of twin opposites through time and reality. What then are we to make of the fact that in this story, the twins die? The anima is clearly the key to whatever the twins represent in the Ulsterman's collective soul. When she's mistreated, they die, and the people responsible are cursed. I think this is related to the collective soul of the land. It's a strange fact that, of all the parts of Ireland, different communities have integrated. In other provinces, there are no Norman communities or British Unionist side of towns, no Viking-only streets. In Britain, there are no Anglo-Saxon or Norman housing estates. In Scotland, no Pictish sides of town. Yes, there are different religions and political cultures, but under one overarching Irish or Scottish or English identity. But in Ulster, there are two communities that insist on being completely distinct from each other. Two populations, two national identities, two flags, two languages, two religions, two cultures. In Armagh, there are two hills, pagan and Christian, Awan Macha and Ard Macha, two cathedrals for the two religions, two languages, two cultures, two peoples. It seems that duality is somehow baked into the northern land more deeply than other places. Why though? Why would Ulster be different? In 1916, Jung had found himself compulsively painting a particular image. This lasted until the late 1920s when Richard Wilhelm sent him a copy of an ancient Chinese alchemical treatise called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which astonished Jung, as there in the book were the images he'd been painting. The mandala, which in its basic form consists of a circle with 4 points around the outside converging on a central point in the middle. He discovered that the mandala is a universal cross-cultural archetype. It represents the self, the totality of the psyche, incorporating both conscious and unconscious elements, animus and anima, ego and shadow, with the self in the middle. The idea of four with a mysterious fifth recurs throughout not just Jungian ideas, but many philosophies. There are four elements: wind, earth, fire and water. The ancient Greeks concluded that for these elements to flow, there needed to be a fifth element, one which allowed each to move. A spirit, what they called the essence. The fifth essence was a superior and more divine element to its terrestrial counterparts. In Latin, the fifth essence is quinta essentia, which gives us the English word quintessence. When we say a quintessentially Irish town, we don't mean it has individual aspects that make it Irish, but that it embodies all that it is to be Irish, the spirit of being Irish, that elusive quality that's hard to pin down, but is yet everywhere. Equally, the whole self, the product of psychological wholeness, exists at the centre and is the very essence of you. Not purity and certainly not only good, but an integrated and balanced version of all elements of the soul. Even in the Christian cross are four corners of the mandala with an inevitable fifth point in the middle, holding the whole structure together. As I mentioned earlier, Jung believed the Christian Trinity should have been a quaternity. Integrated, these elements lead to the divine self in the middle, the centre of wholeness, God as such. Jung, who developed the terms extrovert and introvert, also came up with four basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Of these, one will always be your inferior function. For most, it's intuition, especially for the scientific-minded. Your inferior function is that which needs work and attention, as it's been ignored and put into shadow. I think this also maps onto the collective soul of nations. With the mandala in mind, here's a map of ancient Ireland. We weren't always only divided into 4 provinces, but 5. The Irish word for province is cuig, the Irish word for 5. And in ancient myth, each province had its own gifts to provide. It was said you went to Leinster for prosperity and wealth, Munster for music and culture, Connacht for knowledge and wisdom, Ulster for battle and war, to test oneself and hardiness. In the middle was the 5th province, Meath. The 5th province represents high kingship and sovereignty. As Michael Dames so beautifully put it, quote, "Many scholars think that the elusive 5th province stands for something more fundamental. The likelihood is that ever since the Stone Age, and despite numerous boundary changes in detail, Ireland has been subdivided into 4 provinces held together by a mystical 5th, territorially elusive, yet vital to the cohesion of the whole sacred array. But since the mythic view of reality declares that efficiency is the outcome of magical accord between the seen and the unseen, there is more to Meath than just simple geometry. Meath, the notional centre of Ireland, was conceived as a point where an umbilical cord attached the country to the womb of the gods, who endlessly created and sustained its existence from above and below." Unquote. The fifth province is just as divine and mysterious as the individual self, the centre of the human psyche, the fifth element of the human mind, the quintessence of existence itself. To me, this looks like a map of a nation's soul. What is needed for a country differs to what is needed for the individual. For a nation, there needs to be prosperity, trade, and a good economy. There's Leinster. There also needs to be a knowledge of history, geography, medicine, economics, as well as religion and spiritual life, Connacht. There needs to be a living culture, stories, music, art, Munster. And finally, there needs to be warriors, an army, knowledge of battle for defence against invasion, Ulster. With these three elements, you create the spirit of a nation, its fifth element, what it is to be from that land. There is no defined territory of the fifth province because it's everywhere and therefore nowhere. In the words of Hermes Trismegistus, quote, "God is a circle whose centre is everywhere and circumference nowhere." Unquote. The stone of Ishnock was the site of the High Kingship. The ancients believed this was the geographical centre of Ireland. An ancient royal site sits in every province where provincial kings were crowned, but the middle was reserved for the High Kingship. In Jungian thought, to reach the High Kingship of the psyche, men must embody the four psychological types I mentioned before: lover, warrior, magician, and leader. Once these have been integrated, the High King is born, the archetype of the king, king with a capital K. This is why Christ, a symbol of the self, is said to be king in the phrase, "Christ is king." Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings follows the same mandala, warrior in his ranging, priest or magician when he raises the dead to fight, lover with his one true love whom he is faithful to, and leader of the movement that confronts the shadow in the dark lands of Mordor. In the end, Aragorn becomes High King, the golden self, the fifth element. So out of this mandala of the Irish soul and ancient lore, what can we learn for today's Ireland, and what the hell does this all have to do with Macha and her twins? Well, I think Ulster is Ireland's inferior function, is Ireland's intuition, the dark feminine side of the Irish psyche. The Morrigan, of which Macha is one face, I think dwells in Ulster. Ulster is where you're tested by nature, physical reality, battle, war. The maiden, the war goddess, and the sage make up the trinity of the northern goddess, the anima of the Irish soul, and the epicentre of Macha, her height, is Ard Macha, Armagh. When we look at a map of Ireland today, what do we see? Ulster with a tear through it, a fractured anima, divided, a scar on the face of Macha, her dwelling place hidden from the rest of the land by a psychological ravine, a line existing only in the minds of the beholders. Ulster is the shadow of Ireland's soul. Ireland hobbles forward as a trinity, trying to ignore its shadowy northern side, its dark side, but its shadow element will always kick out when ignored or slighted, destabilising the whole country. Ireland pretends to be whole, but simply can't be without recognising Ulster. The common shamrock needs to be replaced by the more elusive four-leafed clover. So what is the actual contents of Ireland's shadow? What gold is guarded by the dragon that could make Ireland whole? As Jung said, quote, "That which you most need will be found where you least want to look," unquote. The knight could live the easy life without confronting the dragon, but he won't find the treasure or the princess. Where does Ireland least want to look? What lives in Ulster that the Irish ego wishes would simply disappear? In the depths of Ulster lives what the Irish psyche does not want to acknowledge about itself: its British identity. For centuries, Ireland suffered mercilessly at the hands of the British Empire. Violence, displacement, hunger. With such a traumatic past, it's easy to break free and try to pretend it never happened, leaving the wounds to fester in hate and collective trauma. But a country cannot be tied to another for so long and not have part of that culture and nation as part of itself, no matter how much you wish it wasn't true. The The great mistake of Irish nationalism seems to be the fantasy of returning to a version of Ireland before even the Norman incursions almost 900 years ago. A return to Gaelic Ireland, and overarching Irish identity for the whole island based on what we wish it would look like. But this would be to ignore a fundamental part of Ireland's true identity, and that's pretty normal. That's what we all do. We shove the things we don't like about ourselves, the things we wish were different about us, down into the depths of the shadow, and we try to be the version of ourselves we wish we were. We ignore reality, and ultimately, we never know our true selves. After all, who wants to admit that their abuser is responsible for part of their identity? On the Temple of Apollo in Delphi was inscribed the maxim, "Know thyself," reflecting the belief that the true meaning of life is to know who you really are. We can continue to pretend that our true identity is Guinness and shamrocks and leprechauns, but this is a fabrication. It's not who we really are. The British identity of Ireland dwells in Ulster. With some, the fantasy remains that force of arms will drive the British administration out, but the British identity part of Ireland cannot be removed. To fight that is to fight against part of yourself. It needs to be recognised, integrated and accepted. For Irish nationalists, the goal is a united Ireland. This lies not in armed struggle or revival of the Irish language, but in the loyalist communities themselves, the place they least want to look. The inner tension caused by the denial of Ireland's British identity plays havoc with the country periodically, and will continue to unless the hurt, the horrors, the terror of the past inflicted on the Irish are put to rest, forgiven, and the British identity, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, is recognised, integrated and accepted, as well as the suffering that Irish nationalists caused to their unionist counterparts. Otherwise, we're denying the reality of what Ireland actually is, its true character. This isn't a political act, but an act of healing. Not a united Ireland, but Ireland united. The same also goes for the loyalist unionist communities in the north too. Decades of being attacked by their shadow has hardened their attitudes understandably towards Irish national identity. But this is their shadow. Their denial of their Irish identity is the same wound as the Irish nationalists' wound. The denial of the Irish part of themselves causes what looks like an irrational madness at times. Unionist politicians claiming that Belfast is as British as Barnsley, wishing the rest of the island would disappear, insisting they have nothing to do with the rest of the country. It causes the place names around them to become utterly meaningless. Non-engagement with the Irish language and culture creates a scenario bizarre in the eyes of the world. An insistence that Irish men in Ireland are not Irish and have nothing to do with Ireland. A refusal to acknowledge the wrongdoings of the past, colonial violence, land appropriation, enforced starvation. This is just the same effect on unionists as nationalist denials have on them. In Ulster, these twin denials, twin shadows, cause each side to lash out at each other. And here we land back at Macha's twins, this strange little detail at the end of the foundation myth. Like the human psyche, deep in the shadow, we have the unintegrated anima. Ulster will always be a place of dual identity, at odds with each other. This is why the land is battle, strife, war. It tests. One of Jung's most famous quotes states, quote, "Everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is, because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be." Unquote. What a nation doesn't know about itself, about what is brooding and broiling underneath, in the dark. A nation that no longer listens to its collective landscape can doom itself to never-ending cycles of misery. Even in our modern age, we have continued to unconsciously act out the myth of Macha's twins. Like Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And sometimes there occurs an atrocity so horrific, so vile, that the myth itself, ignored for so long, bursts out of the collective dreamscape, through the veil containing it and into the corporeal world. But only for those with eyes to see. Do you see it now? Do you see the three goddesses in one? Do you see the twins? The end of the last cycle of killing the twins. Isn't it time we paid attention to our myth? For their sake at least. Remember what Jung said, because she is his greatest danger, she demands from him his greatest. Is this our greatest? Killing women and children? The utter failure once more of the Ulster men to protect the innocent. When will we act? When will we step in and say enough, instead of standing on the sidelines watching? But what if Macha isn't forced to race? What if compassion and kindness had shone through in that dark and unlikely place? What if the twins had lived? Because implicit in the myth is another path. Myths are stories of what will happen if, not what is absolute. There's an unexplored reality, one where the twins survive and live in symbiotic relationship. Maybe through integration with each other in Ulster, taking on and respecting elements of each other's culture, understanding, compassion, recognition of the past and its wrongs, and future healing. Deeds that take true courage, mishnak, to perform. What would Ireland look like in a world where the twins live? Because the anima, when integrated, brings compassion, understanding, creative power. Look what it did for Kruniac's house. For centuries, the Ulstermen have been lacking these qualities towards their twin communities. We have rejected the sacred feminine and dismissed her, preferring the path of conflict, war, division, and domination. And so, we continue to be cursed. Maybe we should look deep into not just our own souls, but our collective soul, our collective shadow, and finally free what has been in the dark for so long. Bring what yearns to be seen, blinking and smiling, into the light. It was my daughter, whenever I first told her the myth of Macha's twins, that pointed out to me, so the twins are demigods. And I remember thinking, wow, I never really realised that. Their mother is a goddess and their father is a human. This mural is in Belfast, and I love it because I don't think the artist knew the twins myth, but somehow intuited to represent peace with a grown girl and boy. Twins, alive and grown, reaching out to each other, given the chance to live. The symbols of Mishnak all around them. Maybe someday we'll let them live, grow up and flourish. And maybe those little demigods will reach out to us, take us by the hand and lead us, finally, back to the 5th province, where we can, at last, know who we really are. I'll leave you with the sound of the wind of Jung and Maka again, only this time, listen to what she's saying, for that hint of rage from a goddess who just wants her children to live.